Today we're going to be talking about cognitive behavior therapy. This is among the most important of all therapeutic modalities. Certainly, no class in counseling would be um, complete these days without doing a thorough overview and introduction of cognitive behavior therapy. So let's go ahead and get started. The name cognitive behavior therapy is a combination of two approaches to psychology, a kind of the cognitive approach to psychology and the behavioral approach to doing psychology. Notice that in a lot of areas that we've talked about so far in counseling, there is the particular theory or theoretical orientation as it pertains to psychology in general, and then there's that theoretical orientation as it pertains to mental health treatment. And so, for example, Sigmund Freud had a view of human behavior and the human psyche, and that could be called psychoanalytic. That refers to how people's personalities are constructed, how people develop, how people get along with in the world. But that also is a very specific form of mental health treatment. Uh, the same can be said of the cognitive and behavioral approaches. They are two very different ways of looking at the world. In short, very short summary, you might argue that the cognitive perspective has to do with how a human organism thinks about the world, perceives the world, understands the world mentally, whereas a behavioral approach refers to how the human organism behaves. And both have been heavily rooted in scientific methodology. A little more complicated to do that from the cognitive perspective, but the fields of brain imaging has revolutionized the field of cognitive psychology, as well as several other movements. And so now, today, these two views in psychology are considered to be central and even foundational to understanding how human beings behave and how they think. And really, that's a nice summary of all of psychology, isn't it? You might say that a good working definition of psychology as a discipline is the study of how people think and behave. And these two approaches, the cognitive approach to psychology and the behavioral approach to psychology, both have a therapeutic orientation as well. Stated very simply, the cognitive model takes a look at how people think and reasons that if you can change the way a person thinks about themselves or thinks about a problem, you can change how they feel and behave. And of course, we've already talked about the behavioral approach. The behavioral approach argues that if you can change how a person behaves, then you can change how they feel and think. So it's kind of a chicken and an egg issue. One of the reasons why the cognitive approach and the behavioral approach are often linked together is because theoretically they don't overlap very much, meaning you can kind of tack on one to the other rather nicely. Now, that may surprise you. Most people will say that the cognitive approach and the behavioral approach do overlap a lot, and that's why they often are paired together under the name cognitive behavior therapy. I would actually argue it's the opposite. If one area does not try to dominate the other, then there can be room for both of those approaches to coexist. And I think that because they focus on such different things, you can actually implement aspects of both together without muddying the waters of one particular theoretical orientation. So, very briefly, cognitive behavior therapy is a combination of cognitive and behavior therapies. It's usually abbreviated to just Cog-B. So, if you hear a therapist talking today, you might ask that therapist, what is your particular theoretical orientation when you do counseling? They might say, I do Cog-B. It's a very popular and very trendy in the last 20 years or so theoretical orientation because it's very user friendly and because it is one of the empirically validated treatments for a host of mental health issues. It has been empirically validated also to treat several disorders, including depression, phobias, anxiety, personality disorders, although not all personality disorders, some, and substance abuse. It's also very helpful because when you say that you do cognitive behavior therapy, the chances are much better that that the insurance company that the client is working with will reimburse you for services rendered. The reason why is because insurance companies only want to reimburse therapists for doing the type of therapeutic work that they think will lead to a successful outcome. And because cognitive behavior therapy is associated with success for a lot of people, insurance companies tend to look upon it very favorably. For those of you wanting to become therapists, I'm not trying to say that this is what you should become. Indeed, I am not first and foremost a cognitive and behavior therapist. You have to go with what feels right for you. But a lot of people, for very practical reasons, understandably so, choose to become cognitive behavior therapists because there's a better chance that their therapeutic approach will be successful and that they will be reimbursed for their efforts. Cognitive behavior therapy works well with chronic and severe, but then also less severe disorders. So it isn't just flexible in terms of the amount of people that you can see, it's also flexible across severities of disorders. Okay, several assumptions with Cog-B. First is that we're more than just stimulus response machines. It goes beyond the assumption that we are passively relating to our environments the way a radical behaviorist approach would argue. We're not just simply determined by our genes or by our intrapsychic dynamics. We have conscious agency, meaning that we are capable of thinking and reasoning about the world and then acting upon those thoughts. That thinking often leads to certain behavioral outcomes. And the assumption we already talked about is that changing the way we think will then change how we feel and behave going forward. So the problem, according to a lot of cognitive therapists, is that it's our understanding of the problem or our perception of the problem that is actually problematic and not necessarily the problem itself. Further, we are more motivated by here and now realities and expectations for the future than we are the past. So in this area, cognitive behavioral therapy agrees with behavior therapy and with Gestalt therapy and with person-centered therapy that the here and now is more important than living in the past. So some fundamentals of Cog-B. First is a collaborative relationship with the therapist. The argument here is that psychopathology is a disturbance of cognitive processes, and how we think about problems is more important than even the problem itself. And so that the best way to solve that is through a collaborative relationship with the therapist, where the therapist kind of approaches counseling as someone who's trying to solve a mystery and tries to get you to say what your experience of the problem is so that the therapist can potentially examine how you choose to think about the problem, and then, of course, try to get you to think about it in new ways. Cog-B is very time limited and focuses on specific goals. And the behavioral element really comes into it when you consider there are lots of homework assignments, there's lots of direct advice giving, and it's the back and forth between therapist and client is much more interactive. The therapist does a lot more talking. The therapist plays a much more active role than with the typical passivity of psychoanalysis. The argument about that the argument that cognitive behavior therapists make that changing the way that you think will change the way you feel and behave has a lot of research that supports it. A recent meta-analysis in psychiatry research neuroimaging showed that there's decreased activity in the amygdala as the result of going through cognitive behavior therapy. Remember, the amygdala is the brain structure most responsible for anger and fear. And so having gone through Cog-B, there's decreased activity in this area of the brain. There's also decreased activity in the left precentral gyrus and increased activity in the left anterior cingulate. These are also areas where lots of negative thoughts are housed in the brain. Alfred Adler, whom we've already discussed as one of the neo-Freudians, really was probably the first true cognitive behavior therapist. His quote here, "Meanings are not determined by situations, but we determine ourselves by the meanings we give to situations." That's classic Adler and a classic mindset in the cognitive behavior perspective. The problem is not the problem. It's what you think the problem is. That's the problem. Also, in talking about, of course, Adler's extensive discussion of inferiority and superiority and the ways in which we feel like we are less than and the ways that we try to strive to feel better about ourselves. Lots of those mindsets are affected by our perceptions of things. With birth order, remember he argued that birth order is very important, but not because being the oldest or being the middle child or being the youngest child necessarily means something for your life. But remember, the importance of birth order lies in the perception of what it means to be the oldest, the middle, or the youngest child in your particular family. So it doesn't being the oldest doesn't necessarily mean anything. What he was much more interested in was how did your family perceive you as the oldest child, and what does it mean in your family to be the oldest child? So again, we're coming back not to the facts of the matter, more to our perception, our read or our take on those facts, our interpretation of those facts. That's what matters the most. Probably the most famous cognitive behavior therapist of all time, and someone who listed Alfred Adler as his personal hero, was Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis invented a form of therapy called rational emotive behavior therapy. We will also discuss later, after Albert Ellis, the work of the pioneer in cognitive therapy called Aaron Beck. And then we will also discover the work of Donald Meichenbaum and his cognitive behavior modification. Each of these researchers contributed significantly to the development of cognitive behavior theory and therapy. So first, Albert Ellis and his rational emotive behavior therapy. There's Albert Ellis again. He is probably the most famous. One of the reasons why Albert Ellis was so famous was because of his personality, which was very blunt, very direct, very outspoken. He famously would give, in front of large groups, he would give demonstrations of cognitive behavior therapy at work. And in some of those demonstrations, he would chastise people. He would attack them for their what he considered to be irrational thoughts. And he was really quite a dynamo. He would cuss and swear, and he would encourage his clients to come up with dirty little rhymes to sing to themselves as a way of mocking themselves or ridiculing themselves, not to make them feel worse about themselves, but to help them not care so much about what other people think and feel. So his form of therapy was called rational emotive behavior therapy. The key word here is rational. Albert Ellis believed that most people have irrational thoughts, thoughts that we shouldn't have, thoughts that get us in trouble, thoughts that trip us up, thoughts that always manage to make us feel worse about ourselves than better about ourselves. And so what he thought was the best approach was to teach us how to think more rationally and therefore to go easier on ourselves. He believed that our cognitions, and by the way, whenever I say the word cognition, just think of the word thoughts. Our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors all interact with each other, and each has a cause and effect kind of relationship with the other. So Ellis believed that all of these things work together dynamically, and he had a very holistic approach to his feelings about human beings. Again, here, this is classic Albert Ellis and classic cognitive therapy thought here. Our experiences aren't as important as our perceptions of those experiences. Albert Ellis was an atheist, which comes up a lot in his work because he believes that lots of people have lots of guilt in their lives because of their religious obligations. He believed that most people have a lot of hang-ups because they're so worried about pleasing God or doing the right thing or being perceived by the do-gooders of the world as being sinful or evil. He really believed that religion was a big problem, and he encouraged lots of people to move past this idea that it was important that we believed in God. Again, he wasn't a militant atheist that thought that there was no God. His problem was not whether or not God existed. His problem was primarily that people would often get themselves into all sorts of trouble mentally because of their fanatical devotion to this idea that God was going to take care of their problems, that they needed to rely on God for everything. What Ellis thought people should do is act regardless of whether there's a God or not, to take control of your life, to stop psyching yourself out, to stop always behaving passively. Don't say, for example, like, God, I pray that you will just give me $1 million. Albert Ellis would say, go out and make $1 million. Work hard for it. If that's something that you really want, go make it happen. Stop sitting around and waiting for God to solve your problems. He was also a hedonist, which meant that he believed that people should pursue pleasure wherever possible. He believed that people were way too hard on themselves and that life should be enjoyed. He was also a secular humanist, believing that the human endeavor was the most important of all endeavors, and that we shouldn't concern ourselves about the afterlife or thoughts about the afterlife. We should enjoy ourselves while we're here on this earth. Here's a quote that kind of gets at that idea. Our behavior during our lifetime, as if we were going to be immortal, doesn't make very good sense when the overwhelming probability is that we will not. He believed that this was a very rational approach. Now, as a Christian and as someone who's also a bit of a theologian and philosopher, I have all sorts of problems about Albert Ellis's view here. I think it's full of some pretty big-time holes. But for the sake of understanding Albert Ellis, I think it's important that you understand where he was coming from. The people that he saw, many people that he saw, were ridden with guilt, just overwhelmed with guilt and anxiety, and a lot of moral anxiety about things that they had done wrong. And he believed that this kind of anxiety came from religion, that religion kind of guilted people into feeling a certain way, and that people would be largely better off without it. This is also what really motivated Carl Rogers to rebel against his religious upbringing. You have to understand the context of the day is that many people were trying to break free of the stranglehold that they felt like the church had over their lives. So it wasn't really a Jesus problem or even a God problem. It was really more of a controlling church problem that they had. He made these very ironic appeals to people of faith because when he told people they needed to get rid of religion because that religion was irrational, etc., religious people could always counter by quoting something from the Proverbs. In fact, the whole book of Proverbs reads like a list of rational thoughts and as a guidebook for how to control your mind so that you will not get tripped up. A classic example, Proverbs 23:7, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. This is classic perceptual reasoning that the cognitive behavior therapists tried to champion again and again, and of course the wisdom of Solomon comes through, thousands of years old. Here are some of the primary assumptions of rational emotive behavior therapy. Thinking and acting are more important than expressing feelings. This is a big thing that I agree with here. Our feelings deceive us. Our feelings deceive us. Don't always believe everything that you think or feel because they can often trip you up. We need to pay attention to what we feel and what we think because we can learn from it, but we should never act as if that's the fact of our lives. Our thoughts and our feelings should always be weighed against who we really want to be and who we really are. He believed that people, and this is in stark contrast to Carl Rogers, he believed that we are not naturally geared towards self-actualization, that human beings are very fallible. In fact, he called most people nuts. It reminds me of that country song, God is great, beer is good, people are crazy. Albert Ellis could have written that song. He also said that many, many people confuse what they want with what they need, and that's a big problem. So Ellis, as kind of this sour, sardonic, sarcastic New Yorker, did not have a lot of hope for human beings to save themselves. In fact, he probably believed that most people were rather nuts. But he did believe that through rationality and through thinking and through logic, we can improve our perceptions and therefore improve our lives. He argued that the blame of oneself and the blame of other people lies at the heart of our pathology. He argued that we need to accept ourselves, accept responsibility for what it is that we have done, and above all other things, stop wasting time blaming other people for your problems. He said this is a huge, huge problem that people have, is that we always want to be able to pass the blame for our misfortune onto somebody else, and all this does is make you depressed. All it does is cause you to become paralyzed, stuck in place, and unable to move. He argued that our desires and our preferences are really examples of shoulds and oughts, and whenever you have someone saying you should do this or you ought to do this, that is an expectation, that is pressure coming to you from an outside source, and he said most of that is nonsense, and in some cases can be very harmful and can make us feel miserable. He proposed something called the ABC model of personality. This later was evolved to include D, E, and F. So he said, this is the way most people trip themselves up and stay mentally ill. First, there's some sort of negative event out there that you really can't control, but that event triggers you to think very negatively about the situation. Secondly, you develop a belief about that event that is irrational or untrue, but that keeps that negative event plaguing you and haunting you. Then C are the consequences of that belief. You begin to act as if that activating event was true, was truly hurtful, was truly paralyzing, and there's nothing you can do about it. And what he would do then is he would, as the therapist, conduct the disrupting intervention. This was his very bold, very aggressive, sometimes very profane way of trying to interrupt a person from keeping on tripping themselves up. He would say things like, you need to stop thinking that way. You need to stop thinking that this is the kind of thing that you should be doing. You're being ridiculous. You need to change your attitude. You need to change your view of the world. Snap out of it. Stop tripping yourself up. You don't need these other people in your life. Move on with your life. Move on with your life. And the more you do this, you are going to notice some behavioral changes in your life. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, you're going to feel a whole heck of a lot better once you shed all of these expectations. So his theory, again, was called, or his therapeutic approach was called rational emotive behavior therapy. He said our self-evaluations are key because these are based on our criteria for what will work. So let's say like your name is John. What Ellis would do with you is he would establish John's rules. And John's rules are rules that John comes up with about what is true and what is good and how he should live his life. And some of that may be based on what other people think, but only if John gives permission for that to happen. No one is allowed to tell John what to do. No one is allowed to tell John how to live his life. No one has power over John. John is in charge of his own life, and he is free to listen to other people if he wants to, but he is under no obligation to have to. There are no shoulds or oughts or expectations on John whatsoever. The goal of REBT is to decrease emotional and behavioral disturbances, to help people lead a more balanced and realistic life, and in fact, to develop a philosophy of life that's more balanced and realistic. He believed in two things called unconditional self-acceptance, which is USA, and unconditional other acceptance. It's a way of saying, I am me and you are you, kind of like that Gestaltist prayer. Ellis said that as a therapist doing REBT therapy, you should not develop warmth or intimacy between you and your client because this could foster a sense of dependency where clients become too dependent on their therapists and not empowered enough to do the courageous work of declaring yourself independent. He would, like we said, he would challenge clients very abrasively in his disputes. He believed that this would actually instill confidence in people and not shut them down, as many people thought that he was doing. And he would give homework assignments to people where he would give them self-report forms, and he would have them do difficult tasks and ask people to fill out questionnaires about how they were thinking and what they were feeling as they were doing the homework assignment. I'm going to end this part one on Albert Ellis with a story. Albert Ellis said that he was willing to put his money where his mouth was. He said, I do not believe that I need another person's approval to tell me how I feel about myself. And as a way of proving that to himself, he said, I'm going to go down to the Bronx Zoo, which is the big zoo in New York City, and I'm going to sit out on a park bench in this Bronx Zoo, and every young, attractive woman that comes up to me, I'm going to ask her out on a date. And he did this over the course of many, many, many days, and he asked out hundreds and hundreds of women. And in all that time, he only got one response, and that was a woman who gave him her phone number, and he called her, and they set up a date, and she stood him up. So Albert Ellis walked away from that situation, which would normally cause many people to feel very rejected about themselves, and he said, I feel great about myself. There's no way in this world I'm going to waste 1 minute, let alone 5 minutes, worrying about whether or not someone loves me. Man, what a waste of my time and what a waste of thinking. I have a brain, and it does lots of valuable thinking for me, and I'm not going to do myself any good by dwelling on the fact that I was rejected 500 times. It's ridiculous. And plus, they didn't even really know me. They weren't rejecting me. They were rejecting just a date.
And so he thought, man, it's very easy to move on from something like this. And it should be easy for you to move on from something like this. If you don't love me, fine. If you don't want to be around me, fine. I can be by myself. So this is what he wanted for his people in terms of their independence and their autonomy and their self-reliance.